Before the Epstein files became one of the most controversial document releases of the modern era, there was just a name few people paid attention to: Jeffrey Epstein. For years, he moved quietly through elite circles: financiers, politicians, academics, and celebrities. He wasn't a household name. In fact, most people had never heard of him. Yet behind the scenes, Epstein was building wealth, influence, and access in ways that raised questions long before the public knew anything was wrong. Epstein first appeared in elite financial spaces in the late 1970s and 1980s. He presented himself as a brilliant money manager, someone trusted by powerful clients. What made him unusual wasn't just his wealth. It was how closely he was connected to people far more powerful than himself. Private jets, luxury properties, and introductions to high-profile figures became part of his world. But none of that was public knowledge. The first cracks in the story didn't come from leaked files or dramatic arrests. They came from local reporting. In the early 2000s, police in Palm Beach, Florida, began receiving complaints involving a wealthy man and underage girls. At first, the case seemed small, local, easy to ignore. But as investigators looked deeper, the pattern became harder to dismiss. Multiple victims told similar stories. They described being recruited, paid, and silenced. Some said they were introduced to others. The details were disturbing. But what shocked investigators most wasn't just the allegations. It was how slowly the system responded. In 2008, Epstein reached a controversial plea deal. Instead of facing federal charges, he pleaded guilty to state charges and served a short sentence with work release. For many observers, this moment became the first major question mark in the Epstein story. Why was the punishment so light? Why were federal charges dropped? Why did the case seem to stop before reaching anyone else? At the time, most of the public still didn't know Epstein's name. There were no viral headlines, no global outrage, just court records quietly sealed and a case that appeared to be over. But it wasn't. Over the next decade, journalists, victims' advocates, and legal teams continued pushing for answers. Lawsuits were filed, records were requested, depositions were taken under oath. Slowly, piece by piece, documents began to surface. These documents are what later became known as the Epstein files. It's important to understand what these files actually are. They are not one single report. They are not a final verdict. They are not a list of proven crimes tied to every name mentioned. The Epstein files are a collection of materials: court filings, sworn testimony, emails, flight logs, settlement records, and legal exhibits, released over many years through lawsuits and court orders. Some information is verified, some is disputed, some remains redacted by law, but together they reveal something critical: how power, wealth, and legal systems interacted in ways that delayed accountability. One of the most discussed elements of these files is the presence of names, people referenced in testimony, documents, or flight records. This is where confusion often begins. Being named in a document is not the same as being convicted of a crime. Some individuals deny any wrongdoing. Others say their names were mentioned without context. The files don't deliver simple villains or clean conclusions. Instead, they expose a complex web of relationships that investigators say deserved deeper scrutiny. And that's why the files matter. Not because they provide every answer, but because they show how long questions went unanswered. In 2019, Epstein was arrested again, this time on federal charges. The case reignited global attention. Media coverage exploded. Suddenly, the documents that had been buried in court archives became front-page news. Then, Epstein died in jail. Officially ruled a suicide, his death triggered even more controversy, speculation, and distrust. For many people, it felt like the story ended before it truly began. But legally, the story didn't stop. Civil cases continued. Courts ordered more documents released. Victims kept speaking. and with every new release, public interest grew. The Epstein files became more than records of one man. They became a case study in how influence works, how systems fail, and how truth can take decades to surface, if it surfaces at all. And this is only the beginning. By the time the Epstein files became public conversation, many people assumed they were a single explosive document, a hidden list, a secret report, or a final revelation. But that idea is misleading. In reality, the Epstein files are not one thing. They are a fragmented archive, released slowly, unevenly, and often reluctantly through the legal system. To understand why they cause such shock, you first need to understand what they actually contain and what they don't. At their core, the Epstein files are made up of legal records. These include court filings from civil lawsuits, sworn depositions, email exchanges entered as evidence, travel records like flight logs, settlement agreements, and exhibits submitted during litigation. Most of these documents were never meant for public consumption. They existed quietly in court archives for years. Many were sealed. Some remain sealed even today. One major source of these files came from civil lawsuits filed by victims against Epstein and his associates. In these cases, attorneys gathered evidence through discovery, the legal process where both sides are required to exchange information. That process produced thousands of pages of material, much of it deeply sensitive. Another major source came from defamation lawsuits, where sworn testimony was taken under oath. In those depositions, witnesses answered questions about who they met, where they traveled, and what they observed. These statements are legally significant because lying under oath carries serious consequences. However, sworn testimony is still testimony, not a verdict. That distinction matters. Many people misunderstand what it means for a name to appear in these files. A name can appear for many reasons. Someone may have been mentioned in passing, listed in an address book, referenced in an email, or included in a travel record. In some cases, individuals have publicly denied allegations or said they were never involved in wrongdoing. The files document claims, connections, and denials, not automatic guilt. This is why courts approach their release carefully. Judges are tasked with balancing public interest against privacy rights, due process, and the risk of defamation. That's why many documents were released in redacted form, with names, locations, or identifying details blacked out. In some cases, entire pages remained sealed to protect victims or individuals who were never charged. This slow, controlled release frustrated the public. People wanted clarity, they wanted conclusions, they wanted accountability, but the legal system doesn't move at the speed of outrage. One of the most discussed elements of the Epstein files is flight logs. These records show travel on private aircraft associated with Epstein. While flight logs can confirm who traveled and when, they do not explain why someone traveled, what happened during the trip, or whether any crime occurred. Context matters, and flight records alone cannot provide it. Emails and contact lists are another major component. These documents show communication networks and social proximity. Again, proximity is not proof. But for investigators and journalists, patterns of access raise legitimate questions, and that's where the discomfort begins. The Epstein files don't offer a single explosive truth. Instead, they expose how power networks function, how wealth and influence can create environments where scrutiny is delayed, minimized, or redirected. Another critical point often overlooked is that many of these documents only became public because of persistent legal pressure. Victims fought for years to unseal records. Journalists filed motions. Judges reconsidered earlier decisions. Transparency was not automatic. It was forced. Even then, it was incomplete. Some documents remain sealed due to ongoing legal standards, privacy concerns, or because they involve individuals who were never charged. This fuels speculation, but it also reflects the limits of what courts can responsibly release. This gap between what exists and what is public is one reason the Epstein files continue to provoke debate. Some people believe the files prove systemic corruption. Others argue they show the dangers of drawing conclusions from partial information. Both perspectives exist, and neither fully resolves the issue. What the files clearly demonstrate is this: accountability often depends not just on evidence, but on power, timing, and public pressure. Without sustained attention, many of these records might have remained buried forever. The Epstein files are not a final chapter. They are a snapshot of a legal process still unfolding, shaped by lawsuits, court rulings, and the voices of those who refuse to be silent. As public attention intensified, one question dominated headlines and online debates alike. Why weren't all the Epstein files released at once? The answer lies in how courts handle transparency, privacy, and risk, especially in cases involving sensitive testimony and unproven allegations. When judges consider unsealing documents, they follow a specific legal framework. The public does have a right to access court records, but that right is not absolute. Courts must weigh it against other principles: the safety of victims, the presumption of innocence, and the potential harm caused by releasing unverified claims. In the Epstein-related cases, many documents included graphic testimony, private addresses, medical details, and names of individuals who were never charged with any crime. Releasing everything without review could have caused irreversible harm, particularly to victims and to people mentioned only tangentially. This is why judges ordered phased releases. Some documents were unsealed only after redactions. Others were delayed for years while courts evaluated objections. In several instances, judges explicitly stated that releasing certain names would serve curiosity, not justice. That distinction matters. The legal system is designed to determine guilt through trials, not documents. And in Epstein's case, the criminal process ended abruptly with his death. There was no final trial, no cross-examination of all witnesses, and no verdict that could establish a full historical record. This created a vacuum. Into that vacuum rushed speculation, theories, and assumptions, some grounded in evidence, others not. The Epstein files became symbols of something larger, the fear that powerful people operate beyond accountability, but symbols can distort reality. The files show patterns of access, influence, and privilege. They show how Epstein embedded himself in elite circles. They show how warnings were ignored and investigations delayed. But they do not provide a complete map of guilt or innocence. Another critical limitation is jurisdiction. Many alleged events occurred across borders involving multiple legal systems. Evidence that might matter in one country may not meet standards in another. Statutes of limitation, lack of cooperation, and missing records all restrict what can be pursued. Time also erodes truth. Memories fade, documents are lost, witnesses disappear. The longer justice is delayed, the harder it becomes to reconstruct events with certainty. By the time many Epstein-related cases gained traction, decades had already passed. This is one reason accountability often feels incomplete. It's also why some records may never be released. Courts are unlikely to unseal materials if doing so offers no clear public benefit and carries high personal harm. Transparency has limits, even in cases that ignite global attention. So what do the Epstein files ultimately represent? They are not a final expose. They are not a list of verdicts. They are not closure. They are evidence of a system strained by wealth, influence, and delay. They show how victims were silenced for years and how persistence eventually forced parts of the truth into the open. They show the importance of investigative journalism, civil litigation, and public scrutiny in cases where criminal justice falls short. Most importantly, they serve as a warning. When accountability depends on power structures, justice becomes fragile. When transparency is delayed, trust erodes. And when cases end without resolution, history is left with questions instead of answers. The Epstein files may never deliver the full truth many hope for, but they do leave us with something essential: a record of what happens when oversight fails, and a reminder that vigilance, not silence, is what keeps systems honest.